I'm going to start off reading from my phone because I thought I printed off more pages of something than I had. So we're currently sat within, and especially you're at the back row, you're very close to some of the works from Sugar, which is Marlene's solo exhibition. So if you're in the back row, be careful when you're shuffling your chair out. Icing sugar is not best when it has some pressure on it. So Marlene Smith, you can say hello now if you want.
Hello, everybody.
I'm going to do that weird thing where someone introduces someone that sat next to them. So Marlene Smith is a British artist and curator. She was one of the founding members of the Black Art Group, and she was director of the Public in West Bromwich, and UK research manager for Black Artists and Modernism, a collaborative research project run by the University of the Arts and Middlesex University. She's recently exhibited work as part of Women in Revolt at Tate Britain, The More Things Change at Wolverhampton Art Gallery, Cut and Mix at New Art Exchange Nottingham. The Places Here, the work of black artists in 1980s Britain and Nottingham Contemporary. And I do have to give a shout out to the people that made this exhibition possible, which includes the Elephant Trust, Henry Moore Foundation, and Labena Hamid. And also to let you know, if anyone happens to be in Glasgow, the exhibition is going to go to the Glasgow School of Art Reed Gallery on the 2nd of November. Yeah. Marlene Smith's going international. In my eyes, Scotland is a different country. And the exhibition is part of the wider programme that I've been doing at Cubitt for the last 2 years, over 2 years, called Feeling Still in a World Which Runs, which includes new commissions from Marlene, as well as Matthew Wayne Parkin, Nicholas Singh coming next year, Kirsty Russell, and we're going to be showing, and we also showed a two-person exhibition of existing work by Anne-Marie Copestake and Muad Al-Salam. So yeah, I think that's most of the housekeeping. The fire exit's there. So if anyone needs a comfort break, please feel free to shuffle awkwardly down the middle. And yeah, I think maybe we'll just get started. Yeah. So I just wanted to start off by detailing how Marlene and I first met, and sort of beginnings of these conversations that led to this exhibition, as well as the sort of I'm looking at my notes now because as well as what, Sean? How Marlene and I met, how we first started talking about this exhibition, and also where the conversations were then and where they are now in relation to me and Marlene and the relationship that sort of built over that time. So I was living in Birmingham at the time. This was maybe 6 years ago now, which seems insane that it was that long ago. And I was working at a space called Grand Union, and I had invited Marlene to do a talk at Grand Union, and Marlene said no, and then asked if I'd go out for coffee. So then I went out for coffee, and then we kept going out for coffee, and then coffee became studio visits, and then there was a conversation that happened with Marlene and Ajamu, whose collaborations with Marlene are still visible on the wall. They haven't been packed away. And we presented a in conversation with me sort of sat between Marlene and Ajamu that was called See You at Breakfast, Memory and Materiality. So the name of this event is kind of an homage to that first happening. And it's a shame that Ajamu's not here, but we wanted to sort of give a nod and a wink to that event that happened and felt like a really sort of important point in me and Marlene knowing each other.
Yeah, just to say that when Sean invited me to do that talk, I didn't just say a blank no.
No.
Blanket no. I did suggest to him a different way that we could have a conversation, which ended up being me, him, and Ajamu talking about yeah, friendship and
Yeah. But it's less funny if you tell it that way. But we sort of had a really amazing conversation, and I think one of the things that came up repeatedly was not wanting to talk about things in historical terms and not wanting to talk about practices in historicized terms, and wanting to talk about the materiality of a practice and wanting to talk about the nowness of a practice. And I think that really is an important thing to be thinking about when you're talking to artists of a certain generation, but also when you're talking to artists that were such a key part of the Black art group, of the Black art movement in the UK. There's a danger of like historicizing and sort of fixing them in a certain time and place. So it's really refreshing to have work in this space that we can really materially engage with. So my first question I'm going to get to eventually, I promise, is just sort of thinking about the works that are in this space. And I don't know how many of you have seen the exhibition, but the furniture which these icing sugar sculptures are sat upon are all built at different heights. So they all reference different pieces of domestic furniture through their dimensions. And previously, Marlene, you've discussed the ways that you made most of your early work either at the end of the kitchen table or in your living room, and that your first studio is something that you've had only in the last few years. And I know that there's various tools that have come into contact with the sugar sculptures. There's like a mangle, this like big old thing that squeezes water from clean clothes, rolling pins, as well as other things. And I just wanted to ask about you describing the demands you're making of quite a modest material in the icing sugar. And that was something that really interested me, this like investment in a materiality. There's like a trust and a confidence in a material as simple as icing sugar, even if there's some like sort of uncertainty. So hopefully without falling into tropes of the woman artist and domesticity in the kitchen, I was just thinking to ask, like, what do you think is interesting to you about these relationships between these types of spaces and these materials and the labor in your practice?
So, I hope that the kind of layers of the work come across when you're both engaging with the items and kind of reading about the context within which they were made. But thinking about icing sugar specifically, it was some years ago that I first started to think about sugar as a material to work with. And for me, the sugar has both that kind of domestic quality in that it's pervasive. Everybody has sugar in their homes. It has a kind of historical aspect to it because of the history of, where sugar comes from and how that sugar has been manufactured over centuries, and the kind of symbolic role of sugar when you think about the plantation economy. And I do think about and have thought about the plantation economy for a long time because I'm really interested in Black history. I'm very interested in the specificity of my Black history. So I'm very interested in my relationship to my mother and her relationship to her mother, and going back into how I imagine 19th, 18th, 17th century Jamaica. My parents are from that island. So finding a material that has all of these connotations before I've even touched it was really significant, not only to this work, but to my practice in general. And then in terms of coming to grips with this particular body of work, once the decision was taken to work with a particular form of icing, and to be honest with you, I've been thinking about these things for so long, I'm not quite sure when the moment was that I decided that I was going to use fondant icing. But one of the many things about fondant icing as a material is that it is very pliable, so you get it in in a block. You buy it from the supermarket, so I love that it's so easily available. It comes in just a plastic cover, and it's quite firm, but once you start to apply pressure to that material, then you can mould it. And in a way, it kind of reminded me of like working with plasticine when I was little, but also working with plaster and clay when I was a bit older and learning how to be an artist. So it has those types of, it has that kind of feel to it. But at the other end of that, once you start to apply that pressure, it becomes very fragile. The more you work into the material, the more fragile it becomes. And that kind of became a bit of a metaphor for, I wanted the show to be about fragility, vulnerability, as well as, I wanted to my work, and I do this over and over again in my work, I want to have a dialogue and a conversation and a sort of homage to my mother and the generations before her. And so in having a conversation about who those women were, I'm wanting to both acknowledge their strength and resilience, but also reflect on, the vulnerability and the fragility, and I think those aspects of women from that particular part of the world, from that particular relationship with the West, from that particular relationship with the colonial and the imperial past, those aspects I feel don't get discussed and examined very often. And it was important to me to, in the process of making, as well as the finished object, to reveal something about that conversation. So I wanted the material to speak, and my process over the months of making the work was partly about getting to grips with the material itself, and the relationship between that lump of icing sugar and the tools that I manipulated the icing sugar with, and I very much wanted the finished items to be speaking those stories and those relationships. And I feel, I'm the kind of artist that is always disappointed by the finished object. So I am quite hypercritical. But I do feel with this work, seeing it finally in this space, that it does start to have the kind of resonances that I was looking for. And I think for any artist who's working with materials, and particularly if you start working with new materials, you don't quite know where you're going to get to. When you start on something, sometimes what's happening is intuitive. So there's a kind of rationale for using icing sugar. There's a rationale for using the crocheted objects. But then in the process itself, as an artist, you kind of have to allow yourself to let the process unfold in some way, so that as you're working, something is happening and you're in that moment making decisions as you go along about how much more pressure you're going to put on this piece of work, what size it's going to be, what shape it's going to be. And with these pieces, as the process went on, I wanted to press for the fragility and therefore to get thinner and thinner with the icing. And, at some points it did break. Yeah. So there was also, allowing it disintegrate and allowing it to do what it does as icing sugar, and just sometimes just taking the risk and going with that. For the most part, I felt that process has worked well for me, and I feel in a good place with this work.
Yeah, and I think there's what you're describing there, like the sort of character of the materials that you're using and the icing sugar. There's also an unruliness and a unwillingness of the material to do exactly what you want it to do. And it just reminds me of not only this work, but you've used sugar in work previously. So there was Time Travel, which was a piece that was shown at Eastside Projects in Birmingham, and Wolverhampton Art Gallery was sort of run of lace that was sort of suspended in animation by sugar water, by a sugar solution, in the same way that Art History, which is one of your works that's held in the Sheffield Museum's collection, as a vase, and there's this sort of lace vase cover that's also suspended in animation by sugar water. And I know that there's been conversations about conservation with regards to that work, and you've been pretty stoically wanting to make sure that it's continues to be sugar water that's used in that way, despite there being more high-tech solutions or more modern ways of preserving that stiffness of the lace. But yeah, I was just thinking about that time travel work and the lace and the sugar, and even in the paper that these photographs are printed on is a byproduct of sugarcane processing. So there's sort of sugariness in everything. But yeah, I was just wondering about that work using the textiles and the lace directly. Do you think you'll return to that? I think maybe yours is turned off or something, but I can swap. Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah.
So the piece that the kind of history of those works with crocheted elements, and so that the crocheted elements tend to be made out of cotton rather than lace. Back in the late 1980s, I made the work Art History, which is a combination of different elements, but one of the elements is a vase covering that was crocheted by my mother, and my mum died in 2019, but in the late 80s I asked her to crochet a vase covering for me, and then when she handed me the two pieces of this vase covering, she said, you need to stiffen these, and I said to her, I'll stiffen it with starch, and her response was, you don't use starch, you use sugar and water. So that was my first inkling that all of these items that I'd seen in Caribbean homes over the years as growing up, I'd assumed that they were stiffened with starch, but actually it was a solution of sugar and water, and I just found that really fascinating. And then roll forward to 2021, I think it is, after my mum had passed, and as I was putting her things away, I opened a tureen, and in the tureen was a piece of crochet which I recognized from my childhood. I hadn't seen it for years, and it's a kind of coral-coloured piece of crochet that has all these ruffles, and it used to sit on a particular occasional table in our home. And as I picked it up, it kind of formed this shape that to me looked like a dancer. And so in making the piece that I called Time Travel, what I did was I applied sugar and water again to that piece of crochet, and it kind of formed this shape, which I then pinned into a drawer. And that's the piece that was later bought by the collection at Wolverhampton. So there is this history of me working with both the sugar and the crocheted items. But, I mean, for a long time I've wanted to kind of speak about the body without making bodies, if that makes any sense. And I'm not really sure why that became a objective for me, but I kind of became quite fascinated by how these objects could stand in for humanity in a way. And I felt very much that these items that had been handmade and that had been on display within the home really had that kind of, they had a personality. And they also have a sort of familial history. They've also been touched and molded and shaped. So there's a kind of a trace of, touch in those items. And so all of those ideas kind of came back again when I was in the studio making the work for A Sugar.
I think we've got one to share now. Yeah, I think there was also the display of that work and seeing it in that gesture that was sort of frozen, but still it was like protected by that drawer that it was set within. It was like a really, it felt like it captured a very deliberate gesture that was also kind of just happenstance or something. But that work, Time Travel, reminded me, the fact that it was called Time Travel, it reminded me that Labaina Hamid, in your interview in Freeze, sort of described some of the icing sugar works as almost being like archives in a way. And then she also mentioned thinking of them like letters or like a correspondence of sorts. And then that in turn reminded me of a letter that you wrote to Frank Bowling in your youth as a precocious young thing, which like maybe we can discuss. But I was thinking about that relationship between like modes of address and like addressing other influences and like peers through work, and family members and the women of your family, which are named in the sculptural works. I just wanted to ask about where you think you're sort of situating yourself through these modes of address, through this time travel that you're undertaking in like curatorial or artistic ways in relation to artistic or familial peers or ancestors or
Well, so when I'm thinking about what to make, I'm often going back to, the family album, the family history, the kind of associations between generations. So it was interesting to have that conversation with Labaina, talking about both the archive and in my work as an artist and as a curator, I've engaged both in the sort of personal, the family album being, the kind of very central to my work, but also, I worked with and still do with Claudette Johnson and Keith Piper, who are both here, on the Black Art Group research project archive, which is a way of bringing together material from the Black Art Group in the 1980s and making it available to today. So that's been a constant in my life since about 2011. I worked for a few years on a project which you mentioned, called Black Artists and Modernism, when I was looking at thinking about the relationship between black artists working today and the project of modernism. And that took me into, in my specific contribution to that project, that took me into looking at, you know, a group of artists' work in some depth and looking at what was at the time available in the sort of the public archive around that work, and finding that frankly quite abysmal, and trying to address how those public archives might improve and do a better job of reflecting that work. So I feel as though the archive has been a significant part of my practice for at least 20 years. I think in my studio-based work, it feels important to draw in a very personal element to that. And maybe it's an attempt to be authentic. Maybe it's an attempt to just know myself better and to know my purpose better. I'm not sure exactly what drives that. I do know that it feels important, and it's a place that I go back to over and over again. So there are certain images that have come from the family archive in the largest sense of the word that I still haven't resolved how I'm going to work with those images, but they occur and reoccur in terms of my thinking about what to do next. You know, some of the objects that I love the most are bits of correspondence, bits of ephemera, but also correspondence between myself and either artists of a older generation. So you mentioned Frank Bowling correspondence, and also with my peers. So, you know, when I have these conversations with younger artists, I'm constantly talking about the fact that in the 1980s there was no internet. We couldn't ask Google anything. And the way that we communicated was literally by writing things on bits of paper and putting them in envelopes and sending them to each other, which I know to my daughters here, to my daughter's generation, is just like they don't really understand how that could possibly have worked and been efficient. I'm not sure how efficient it was, but it was how we communicated. And then those objects become quite precious, and over time, more and more so. I think I saw that Shuchapa Biswas had posted online an image of a letter that she got from Donald Rodney, and most of you will probably know that there's an exhibition of Donald Rodney's work that started in Bristol, is currently in Nottingham, and will come to Whitechapel next year, which is a really exciting moment for us. And for those of you that don't know, Donald Rodney was part of the Black Art Group in the 1980s, but died very young in 98 of the kind of effects of sickle cell, which he'd suffered from his whole life. And so he was a dear friend of mine. And I also have, so Donald at some point started working with x-rays of his own body. And he would when he'd send you a birthday card, it would be an x-ray of his body with his very untidy handwriting. And so those objects become exceptionally precious, particularly because he's not with us anymore. But equally, you know, I have long turgid letters that were sent to me by other artists, you know, that are that become more and more important as time goes on, and it's a kind of window onto a time that's gone, but it's also, when you read these things, they kind of give you a bit of insight into what the thinking was around the 1980s. So all of those small, incidental things that we make and sent to each other have become really precious to me. It is of its time, as I am.
Yeah. And also of now.
Yeah.
Always. But that preciousness of those materials and the I guess just the snapshot that they give of a particular time and a particular way of communicating, it also brings up lots of opportunity for maybe imagination or thinking in different ways. And when you were describing all of the sort of the family album and when you go to Marlene's studio, there's sort of photocopies and prints and sketches and tracing paper and all of these different things. And there's the reproduction of the photograph of a wedding that was shown at Somerset House a few years ago. But then I was also thinking about, there's a photo of, I think, 2 of your aunties, and they're holding hands, and they've got these white gloved hands. And there was something really, it's just a very beautiful, tender image, but something about you taking it out of that context of the family album meant that it could almost be read as a love story or something between 2 women. And I'm just always. Yeah,
that's one of my favorite images, which I haven't.
I haven't had it to show you.
Yeah, I haven't done anything with it.
Studio when you can.
Yeah, I haven't done anything with it, but it is. They're not actually my real aunties. They're just 2 women that were very close to my family when I was growing up, and they are. The photograph we think is about 1968, 70, and they are really dressed up. They've got hats and matching shoes and gloves, as Seán was saying, and they look really happy. And they're holding hands, and they're looking at the camera rather than at each other, and it's a really joyful image. And they are, they're not skinny girls; they're quite substantial, it's a really intimate image because they're holding hands and they're smiling, and it's a snapshot of their day. They're obviously going to a wedding because behind them is a Morris Minor that's got ribbons on it. It's a kind of ambiguous image, and I really love the kind of potential of it. But I've been looking at it for decades, and I haven't found the right context in which to.
Am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah, maybe I'm not supposed to do anything with it beyond represent it in a frame on a wall somewhere for other people to look at, because I haven't found a way to intervene in it as yet. But there are several images like that. I mean, that's probably my number 1 favorite that I kind of take with me and have been holding on to and making reference to, that I think when you have you come across those types of images, it just suggests an opportunity to have a different kind of conversation about who those people are. And by having a conversation about who those people are, I'm also having a conversation about who I am.
Absolutely. I think there's, throughout the work that's visible in the exhibition and your work that is, on walls or in boxes or, in your studio or in family albums still, the presence of relationships is really shines through. And yeah, like I said earlier, we first started talking about the fact that Marlene was working on a new body of work, and as part of that we sort of committed to doing something together and presenting that somehow, somewhere, and it ended up being this at Cubitt. And that's like been a relationship that's developed, but that relationship also started in conversation with Ajamu, who has been a collaborator of yours for a long time and for this exhibition. I mean, there's also like loads of people to shout out before I ask this final question that we've had relationships with to make this exhibition happen, including like Joseph Bond, who did the amazing furniture design, and Meter Mondays, who fabricated them. But I just wanted to finish by asking, before sort of taking questions from the floor, about your friendship with Ajamu and all the creation that has come alongside that friendship. And what we're seeing here is the result of a series of sessions in his studio. But not everyone in the audience will be privy to this information, but from the sort of earlier works that happened through these sessions leading up to this final presentation here, the body represented in them, your body within them, became sort of moved from representational to increasingly abstract, but still very much bodily. It's very material. And I know that around the time you started photographing with Ajamu, you were sort of having dreams about your mother as well, and thinking about her gestures or her wearing particular things. So I just wanted to finish by asking like how it felt and feels to be engaging with your body as this sort of object of study, and particularly doing that with an old friend and a comrade.
So I first met Ajamu in 1989, but we didn't. And so Ajamu, for those of you that don't know, is a photographer mainly, and has had this photographic practice since the 80s. He's originally from Huddersfield, but also from a Jamaican background, and that may be one of the reasons why we kind of have bonded and continue to have conversations about work over those decades. But we didn't work together until we worked on this. You can't really see it very well, but we worked on a series of images in 2014 for a performance that I did, which really consisted, it was called a dress rehearsal, and it was me dressing in my parents' clubber. Mostly they're kind of really dressy, going out type of clubber. And so I was dressed in my father's suits and my mother's kind of glamorous gowns. And we did a session then. He was at the time studying in Birmingham. So Ajamu lives in London and I live in Birmingham. And he was studying at university in Birmingham doing an MA. And so we organised a day for me to go into the university and I kind of arrived with a sort of suitcase of clothing, and we did a whole day of dressing up. With the work that we did for this particular show, as Seán said, I'd been having a recurring dream of my mother. And in the dream, she was making particular gestures and wearing a dressing gown. And so when I started to work with Ajamu in his studio, is now in Brixton, we started by me kind of recreating some of those gestures. And I don't have my mother's dressing gown, so I had to source one on the internet. And so we started by setting up a situation where I was actually standing or sitting by a dressing table, and it had a wig stand and all kinds of props around it. And the images started as the full body within a sort of setup. But as so what would happen is I would go to the studio, we'd take some photographs. Ajamu works digitally, so those photographs, then we'd look at them on screen, and then he would send me them, and I'd spend some time looking, and then we'd have a conversation about them. And I just kind of became more interested in some of the details, and so things like the grey hair on the back of my shoulders, which I hadn't seen before Ajamu took those photographs. I knew that there was a grey hair on my head and various other places, but I hadn't seen the fact that this hair on my arms and my neck and my back was now silver.
And those grey shoulder hairs look great in titanium print. So in a way, and also I was reflecting on, the process of aging. In my dreams, my mother appeared to me about my age. Anybody who's 60 and over will know that it's a real shock to find yourself 60 and over, and it's like, when the hell did that happen? So there's a kind of conversation about that that's going on. And to my surprise, I actually found those images quite beautiful. And I don't really do that many, I haven't done that much work where I am the subject. And so it's a really interesting, sometimes quite uncomfortable experience to kind of represent yourself in your work. And there's a sort of out-of-body experience of seeing yourself as both object and subject. Because, as an artist, you're looking at shape and colour and texture and weight and all these kinds of formal things that you've kind of trained your eye to see. But then there, you're human, so there's an emotional response to, to all of those processes and all that experience of aging. And so once we started focusing in on particular aspects of that body and that fabric and the folds of the fabric and of the skin, and the silver of the hair on the head and the arm and the back, I think we both just felt that those images were speaking in a way more articulately than the original images. So it felt like a kind of progression to work towards what we ended up showing. But I feel like because we've done several sessions, there's a whole body of images that I might return to and use in different ways in different works from now on. Yeah, and I think in a sort of really basic, formal way, I was just thinking about the folds in the fabric and the bodies and the folds in the sugar sculptures. And the interesting thing about folds being that there's interior and exterior shifts. It changes, and I think there's a real, there's a real tenderness and a real honesty sharing these images, but alongside with the sculptures, it does something really.
I think one of the things that I really like about working with Ajamu is that he emphasizes and has a conversation about the kind of sensuality of the image and of the materials, and I really enjoy that, having that conversation. There's a kind of sensuousness around those particular images, and them in relation to the icing sugar pieces that I'm really very happy with.
Great. Well, we can maybe give Marlene a round of applause. I'm going to try and, as elegantly as I can, unravel this a little bit. But if there are any questions from the audience, then while I'm unraveling, might be a good time to think.
Hey, Andy. I do have a question. I understand that the sculptures are connected by name to some of your family members. Was that an initial thought, or did that come later? Did you make each piece with a person in mind, or did the person come to your mind after you made the piece?
No, it was definitely a retrospective thing. So I've made many more pieces than are in the show. And so there's been an editing process that's happened with exhibiting. So there was the process of making that happened over many months in the studio. And then once the work was here, there were more pieces than we could show. So there was a process of deciding which ones to show in this space. And then once those pieces were placed on their bit of furniture, then I spent some time deciding. So at some point during the process of making, I knew that I wanted to have those, I wanted to name the work, and I wanted to name the work by attaching it to a particular person. So I knew that I was going to do that. So I had a list of names. And then once the work was once each piece was in place, I then made a decision, attaching a name to each piece. So it's it was stages, but definitely the naming happened after the making rather than in the process of the making.
Great title, Sugar, and it made me think about going to Jamaica for the first time as a 22-year-old, and I'd hear people saying, "You have sugar," or "She has sugar," and I didn't know that's what that meant. And then I eventually learned that it meant they have diabetes, monthly sugar is continuing to resonate through the centuries as a destructive force in Caribbean society through the high disease of diabetes. And I wondered if that was part of your thinking in the title.
Actually, thanks, Claude, for that question. I stole the title from a track. I think it's by a reggae artist called Roy Shirley, so it was very early. And when I was literally 6, my mum bought a record, which I always get this wrong. It's either Straighten Up or Tighten Up. But there were 2 sets of compilation reggae albums. No, but there's 2. There are 2. So there is a set called Straighten Up, and there's also one called Tighten Up. And so you have Tighten Up volumes 1, 2 till whatever, 12. And so my mum bought one of those records, and I think I played that record so many times over and over again that I could probably, if somebody put the LP on, I could probably sing every single track on the album. But the one by Roy Shirley was called Ashuga. So it's not Sugar, but it's Ashuga. And I can still hear at the beginning of that song there's like it's not really a rap, but there's talking. And I can remember mishearing what was being said and not really understanding what was being said in the record at all until years later. But when I was doing the performance of a dress rehearsal back in 2014, I went back to Tighten Up or Straighten Up. It's definitely volume 3, but I can't remember it's Tighten Up or Straighten Up. And I used lots of the tracks from that album in the performance. But when I was thinking about working with Sugar, it kind of took me back to this particular track. But in terms of sort of meditating about what Sugar is and what it has been, I'm really conscious of the kind of the prevalence of both overly sugary food in the Caribbean and in Jamaica in particular, and also overly salty food in the Caribbean and in our diets. So I think it's a really, there's that kind of dichotomy between the joy and the pain of it, between its positives and negatives. And even today, my nephew and niece are here from America, and we were having a conversation about coconut drops, and I was telling them that in a visit to Claudette's home not that long ago, we were looking at Jamaican recipes on YouTube, and there was this film of somebody making it's a sort of a sweet, literally a sweet that's made from pieces of coconut and basically sugar. And as a child, I absolutely adored this stuff. And when you look at the recipe, as you say, you chop up the coconut and then you put it in a pot and you put some sugar on it, and then you cook it for a bit longer and you put some more sugar on it, and then when it's cooling you put some sugar on it, and then when it's cooled you put some sugar on it. And so this whole and also a lot of my relatives of my mum's generation did have sugar. They did have diabetes. They did have high cholesterol. They did have high blood pressure. They had all of those sort of ailments that are primarily created as a result of a diet that is heavy in oil and fried food, heavy in salted and dried and cured meats and fish, and heavily sugared. As a child, I have every one of my teeth is filled. As a child, my parents and their friends would bring us sweets. That was, and they did that feeling that they were really doing something fantastic for us, because as children they didn't have as many sweets as they would have liked. So, they made their coconut drops and their gritter cake and all those kind of things at home, using, coconuts and sugar, but they couldn't afford to buy the manufactured sweeties. So when they became parents, they felt that they were doing something good when they were able to buy us, Skittles and opal fruit and whatever it was that our hearts desired. And it was I'm really conscious that as a parent, my child was not allowed to have any sweets whatsoever. None. And, there was a real fight between me and her grandmother, where she would collect my child and she would feed her biscuits and sweeties and put sugar in her tea, because, my mum was absolutely convinced that this sweet thing was not only delicious, but also an important part of her diet. And we had this, I had to just give up and just accept the fact that, my child at home, she didn't have sugar in anything, but when she was with her grandmother, she would be sugared. So, I'm kind of making light of it, but, that when you think environmentally about what's happening with food across the globe, the prevalence of certain types of foodstuffs in our, that is available to us freely and for no money whatsoever, is, it's a real issue. So it's certainly something that I'm very aware of in kind of working with that material.
Have we got maybe a final question? No? Okay, well in that case.
What's next? Oh my goodness. So this show will travel to the Reed Gallery, which is in Glasgow School of Art. And then I've got something in an exhibition in Dundee that's opening towards the end of this month, in a couple of weeks. And then the next big thing for me, I'm going to be taking part in a show at the ICA next year. And the show marks the 40th anniversary of the Thin Black Line. For those of you that don't know, in 1985, Lubena Himid curated an exhibition called The Thin Black Line, in which she invited 11 black women to show their work. So it's kind of a landmark exhibition in terms of the history of the black art movement in this country. So I'm really looking forward to making some new work for that. So those things. And we have a project to make a publication about my work, which we need to get on with. So those are the things that I'm going to be focusing on over the next 12 months or so. Do you know, I haven't addressed myself specifically to that audience, Sandra. Sandra's a wonderful writer who does make work for children, wonderful work for children, but I have to say that I haven't but I haven't made any plans to do that. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, just before we give Marlene a final round of applause, I'll just let you know that we can probably have the bar open for a little bit afterwards. If anybody wants to grab another drink while we pack our seats and things away, please come back and see the exhibition before it closes. We have a screening next week, which includes work by Yogesh Walia and the esteemed Beverly Bennett, who's rolling her eyes at me right now. But yeah, please do come along. Come to Cubitt. I don't know what's up with this microphone today. But yeah, come back. We're very nice and generous and welcoming, I think. We are currently sort of winding down my part of the programme until later in the year. And then next year we have a new commission by Nicola Singh. My colleague Anai, who is somewhere... I see a hand. Hi. Anai is doing a series of gatherings around a new risograph printer and thinking about like a community press and how that would function at Cubitt. So if anyone's local to Islington, please come along. And yeah, just before anyone goes, we are trying to make the resources that we have at Cubitt available to people who need them, and we can't accommodate everything, but please reach out if there's something that we can offer in terms of space that might help a community project or sort of any of those needs, and particularly related to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and recent actions in Lebanon by Israel. So we've sort of done events in the past around that, and we're definitely trying to think about how we can be useful to the communities that we are close to here. So anyway, but for now, thank you, Marlene, and thanks everyone.